Karen Snyder was found murdered when her husband got home on November 11th, 1966. This case remained unsolved for over 50 years. Karen Snyder came into this world on July 29, 1948. She was born in the small town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She had a large family of 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, Karen met a boy named Paul. They decided to get married when Karen was only 17 years old. Shortly after the marriage, Karen became pregnant, and in 1966, they welcomed a daughter named Paula. Even though Karen was only 18 at the time of her daughter's birth, she and her husband were excited and ready to become parents. They relocated to a town called Calumet City in Illinois where her husband's parents lived. The young family lived on the same street as his parents, just a few houses away. This allowed his parents to see Paul each day and spend a lot of time with their granddaughter. With a population of around 25,000 residents, Calumet wasn't far from Chicago, and it was considered a very safe city to live. The young mother spent most of her time taking care of their daughter, while her husband got a job at the local railroad. November 12, 1966, Paul worked his night shift at around 2 p.m. Around 2 hours after that, he tried to call his wife, but she didn't answer. This was unusual because she wasn't supposed to go anywhere and couldn't have left their newborn daughter alone. Paul became concerned and called his parents, who lived just a few houses away, and asked them to check on his wife. They walked to the house and knocked on the family's door, but there was no response. His parents didn't have a key, so they just kept knocking for a while. After still receiving no response, they went home to call their son. Karen's husband became more worried and decided to leave work early to make sure everything was all right. As he approached the house, he got even more concerned because the porch light was off and the blinds were drawn closed. Usually Karen left the porch light on for him when he worked the night shift. He went to open the door with his key, but he realized that it was unlocked. Paul entered the living room and was relieved to find his newborn daughter sleeping in her playpen by the TV. However, he couldn't find his wife, so he began calling out to her while checking every room. When he decided to go upstairs, he tried to turn on the light, but the switch didn't work. Paul made his way to the bedroom and turned on the lamp. This revealed a horrifying scene. The room was destroyed, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor, he spotted his wife, showing no signs of life, and he immediately realized that Karen was dead. After recovering from the shock, he went downstairs, called the police, and took their young daughter outside. While waiting for the police and paramedics, his parents came out to the street and saw Paul crying and begging for help. His mother grabbed a flashlight and rushed into the family's home, hoping to help her daughter-in-law. But as soon as she saw Karen's body, she knew she couldn't be saved. As the paramedics and police arrived, they could only confirm the young mother's death, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. On the back door of the house, they found shallow scratches on the lock, indicating an attempt to pick the lock and break in. The door, however, was still locked, suggesting the perpetrator initially tried to enter through this door, but failed. They then discovered a broken basement window with a trail of blood leading to the front door. Detectives thought that after the perpetrator failed to open the back door, they tried to enter through the basement and cut themselves on the glass, corroborated by the blood on it. The fact that the perpetrator didn't enter through the basement and instead went to the front door suggested it was either unlocked or the young mother opened it for them. In the living room, detectives found more blood, pointing to the attack starting there while Karen was near her daughter's crib. The blood trail continued up the stairs, down the hall, and into the young parents' bedroom where Karen's body was found. The bedroom was in disarray with blood everywhere and many things scattered and broken. This indicated the young mother fought back fiercely. There was a phone in the bedroom that had been ripped out of the wall. Police believed the young woman might have run there to call for help, but she couldn't. Back then, there was an emergency number like 911. Local police had their own number, so detectives thought she might have dialed it wrong in her panic. Detectives also found a blood-covered light bulb on the floor that had been unscrewed from the socket above the stairs. Detectives thought that the intruder removed it, but they couldn't come up with a good reason for it. They may have unscrewed it while following the victim upstairs, giving her a moment to try to call the police. In the bathroom downstairs, detectives discovered a pile of bloody clothes and other items. Among them, there was a pair of pants, a sheet, and a washcloth. Detectives thought that the killer might have used these items to wipe the blood off his hands and clothes. It seemed that he also attempted to clean himself with the washcloth, or tried to use it to wipe blood off the floor to cover his tracks. However, given the amount of blood throughout the house, his efforts were futile. After using these items, the perpetrator threw them in the bathtub and fled the scene. This told investigators that he remained in the house for a while after murder, although they couldn't say exactly how long. Detectives began the investigation and ruled out the possibility of it being a botched robbery. The only thing missing items were the young mother's blue wallet that had $50 and one of the lamps in the bedroom which had no significant value. The medical examiners found 124 stab wounds on Karen. Most of them were concentrated around her chest. Such anger suggested the perpetrator had a personal motive. Experts found the weapon was most likely a knife with a narrow blade, close to a stiletto, but detective couldn't find in the house or anywhere nearby. The young mother was fully clothed, and there were no signs of sexual assault found on her body. However, detectives didn't rule out the fact that this could have been the perpetrator's motive. Something could have just stopped him from carrying it out. Karen's time of death was estimated to be between 4 and 6 p.m., and since her husband discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer most likely left the house several hours earlier. Investigators began their investigation by talking to Karen's relatives and friends. According to her husband's mother, her daughter-in-law had mentioned being afraid to live in their house and said she wanted to move back to Indiana, where her parents lived. However, she never gave a specific reason for why she felt this way, and detectives couldn't find any more information. The young family's neighbor provided an interesting observation. Their dog, who usually barked at everything, didn't make a sound that night. With no other leads, the investigators turned their attention to the victim's husband. In crimes like this, the spouse is usually the primary suspect, so they began investigating Paul. After looking at the evidence from the house, investigators concluded that the attempted break-in on the back door and the broken basement window might have been staged. The perpetrator was likely someone familiar with the victim, but tried to make it look like a random person had committed the crime. This suggested that either the victim let the perpetrator in, or they had a key. Detectives began interrogating her husband while also trying to determine whether he had the opportunity to commit the crime. Detectives also started to consider that Paul might have killed his wife before leaving for work, since he had left after lunch that particular day. Police also checked to see if he stayed at work for his entire shift, or if he left and then returned. Karen's husband denied any involvement in the murder, but the investigators continued to view him as the primary suspect. With little to no evidence, detectives attempted to get a confession from the young husband and father, and repeatedly called him in for questioning. Despite all of this pressure, he continued to maintain his innocence. The young mother's funeral was only 6 days after her murder. In addition to family and friends, investigators also attended and noticed something weird. One of the people carrying her casket had a serious wound on his face and a bandage on his hand. Investigators identified the man as James Barbier. He was a friend of Karen and her husband. He also happened to work with Karen's husband on the railroad and had recently helped with repairs in the house. The victim knew this man well, and she might have opened the door for him if he knocked. Detectives began looking into the suspiciously injured man and discovered that on the night of the murder, he had gone to a local hospital with serious injuries to his hand and forehead that required stitches. This went with the suggestion that the perpetrator injured himself on the broken basement window. James was then identified as the second suspect behind Paul, and detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder. He explained his injuries as him returning home drunk from a bar, tripping over a stump, and hurting himself on some with splinters. James's wife confirmed that he came home drunk that night with an injured hand and a cut on his face. His wife mentioned that he was acting weird and was visibly nervous, but she knew that he was an alcoholic and was frequently heavily intoxicated, so she was used to this behavior. When police interviewed patrons who frequented bars in the suspected perpetrator's neighborhood, they found witnesses who saw their suspect there that night, but they couldn't be sure about the exact times they saw him. When experts finished looking at the evidence from a young family's house, they found something unexpected. As they originally thought, there were 2 different types of blood, One belonged to Karen, while the other belonged to someone with a different blood type. The other blood type they found was a match for James's. The blood type match wasn't proof James was guilty. Investigators decided to arrest him. They were hoping that this would get him to confess. At the same time, they cleared Paul of suspicion because none of the blood evidence matched him. Their suspect continued to deny his involvement. James insisted that his injuries were from his fall. The investigators hoped that forensic experts might find more evidence, but they were disappointed when they didn't. The fingerprints collected at the scene were smudged. Without DNA evidence, they couldn't make any progress with the blood trace evidence. They eventually had to release their suspect and continued searching for new evidence and information. Since releasing James, investigators have looked into several other suspects and interviewed dozens of people, but the case remained unsolved for several years. The young mother's murder changed the small town she lived in, once considered safe. The population remembered the brutal crime for years and wondered who could have been guilty. Investigators didn't release the suspect's information, so only the victim's family and close friends knew of James's potential involvement. In interviews with reporters, the investigators said they thought James was guilty, but they didn't have solid evidence, so proving he was guilty was impossible. No jury would be able to convict him beyond a shadow of a doubt. The victim's father unfortunately passed away in 1973, only 7 years after the tragic killing of his daughter. Karen's mother died 4 years later in 1977. Neither of them lived long enough to find out who killed their daughter. Karen's husband, Paul, eventually got married again, and his new wife helped raise their daughter, Paula, becoming the mother she never had the chance to know. The family decided not to tell Paula how her real mother died. They were trying to protect her from the terrible details. In later years, Paula recalled that when she started school, her classmates teased her because her mother was dead. As she got older, understanding that Paula may hear the truth from others, her family finally told her what had happened to her late mother. At the age of 45, Karen's husband passed away in 1989 due to health problems, along with her parents. He never learned the truth about who had murdered his wife. For several decades, there was no progress in the case. Paula would occasionally give interviews expressing that she hoped to bring down justice on the perpetrator. She also mentioned that she regularly contacted the local police department to see if there were any new developments in the case, but the answer was always no. This continued until the end of 2022, when the police received a call. A 29-year-old man contacted the police department responsible for the case, asking about any new developments. He explained that he knew about the crime his whole life because his grandmother had talked about it since he was a young child. It turned out they were distant relatives of the victim's family. The man was wondering if there had been any progress in solving the mystery. The man said he'd been reading newspaper articles about the case at work and wondered if there were any modern methods that could help solve it. To his surprise, the police department reopened the investigation following his call. As one would think, after so many years, none of the original investigators were around, so a new team began reviewing all the materials from the beginning. They discovered that almost all the evidence, besides the blood samples from the floor of the crime scene, had not only been preserved, but was also well maintained over the 56 years since the crime. This included the victim's clothing and other items from her home. The new investigators sent all the evidence they still had to the lab, where experts examined each item with modern tools. In the meantime, the new investigators re-interviewed everyone connected to the case who was still alive. 16 months after reopening the investigation, investigators received a call from the lab. Experts had found drops of blood on the victim's dress and got a DNA profile of an unknown man. This allowed the detectives to obtain a search warrant from a judge to collect a genetic sample from their main suspect, Mr. Barbier, who was still alive. Detectives quickly got a sample from him, sent it to the lab, and received confirmation. His DNA matched the blood found on the victim's dress. This confirmed that Mr. Barbier, who was only 21 at the time of the crime, had been in the victim's home the day she was murdered, and he had lied about how he got his injuries. April 29, 2024, the detectives returned to check James's home, and the now 79-year-old man was finally arrested for murder. When James was made aware of the DNA match, he didn't deny being the one who murdered Karen, and he confessed to the crime. Detectives have not released his interrogation tapes due to the ongoing court proceedings. But Mr. Barbier admitted to knowing his entire life that he would eventually be caught. James has been charged with first-degree murder. He was released on bail due to his age and severe health conditions. Given his state, it is likely he won't want or be able to flee. The victim's relatives were upset because they had already suffered enough seeing the killer live a full, free life for over 50 years. His motive for crime remains unknown. More details are expected to be released after the trial is over.